What if your ascent to absolute power, your designated path to the throne, was not merely a matter of inheritance or political maneuvering, but was instead paved, quite literally, with the freshly spilled blood of your own siblings? Imagine a world where fratricide and sororicide were not viewed as horrific, unthinkable crimes, but as necessary, almost mundane, steps in securing your reign. A dark calculus of power, where family ties were the first casualty. For Cleopatra's family, the Ptolemaic dynasty that had ruled Egypt for centuries after its founding by one of Alexander the Great's generals. This dark and brutal scenario was not a distant, abstract hypothetical light. Was a deeply entrenched, recurring, and horrifyingly normalized family tradition. A legacy of internal violence that had defined their house for generations. Cleopatra VII Philopator was born in 69 BC, not into a golden age of prosperity, but into a swirling maelstrom of political chaos, deep-seated corruption, and profound societal decay. Her father, Ptolemy XII, mockingly nicknamed Aletes, or the flute player by his subjects for his perceived effeminacy and his decadent, self-indulgent focus on lavish festivals rather than the difficult art of governance, was a fundamentally weak and demonstrably ineffective king. He was utterly and passionately despised by the sophisticated, multicultural populace of Alexandria, the intellectual capital of the world, who watched with growing fury as he systematically bled the ancient, proud kingdom of Egypt dry. His singular, all-consuming obsession was not the welfare of his people or the security of his nation, but the desperate, groveling appeasement of his powerful Roman creditors, the senators and businessmen to whom he had paid astronomical, kingdom-crippling bribes simply to have his questionable claim to the throne recognized by the ever-expanding Roman Senate. This simmering public resentment, fueled by crippling taxes and a profound sense of national humiliation, finally boiled over into open, violent insurrection. The people of Alexandria, pushed far beyond their breaking point, erupted in massive, uncontrollable riots that consumed the capital, turning the streets into a war zone. Facing the very real and immediate prospect of being captured and torn apart by the furious mob, the deeply unpopular and terrified Aletes had no choice but to flee for his life. He escaped ignominiously to Rome in 58 BC, effectively abandoning his kingdom and his children. In the immediate and chaotic power vacuum left by his cowardly departure, Cleopatra's fiercely ambitious older sister, Berenice IV, did not hesitate for a single moment. Immediately seizing the throne for herself and claiming the title of queen, demonstrating the same ruthless opportunism and thirst for power that defined their entire bloodline. However, Aletes was not content to live out his days as a forgotten exile, pleading for scraps in the hallways of Roman villas. After 3 long, arduous years of meticulous, desperate lobbying, endless humiliation, and promising even more of Egypt's dwindling wealth to influential Roman politicians, he finally secured the backing he needed. He returned to Egypt in 55 BC, not as a penitent father, but as a conqueror. He did not come alone. He was backed by the unstoppable, disciplined might of Roman legions, provided by the proconsul of Syria, Aulus Gabinius, effectively returning as a puppet king installed by a foreign power. His first act upon restoring his power, the chilling first order of business in his restoration, was to demonstrate the ultimate unforgiving price of disloyalty. He had his own daughter, the usurper queen Berenice IV, captured and publicly, brutally executed. A horrifying and crystal-clear message to the young Cleopatra and her other siblings about the true, unforgiving nature of Ptolemaic power. This was the brutal, unforgiving, and treacherous political landscape that the young Cleopatra inherited. A world where loyalty was a fatal weakness and familial affection was a liability. The throne was not a seat of honor, but a target. And the greatest threats came not from foreign enemies, but from those who shared her blood and slept under the same palace roof. To survive in this viper's nest, she wouldn't just need to rule with intelligence and cunning. She would need to become more ruthless, more calculating, and more indomitable than all who came before her. Mastering a game where the only outcomes were absolute power or a violent, ignoble death. How does an 18-year-old queen, even one of brilliant intellect and iron will, effectively fight back and secure her own authority when her 10-year-old brother, who is also, by tradition, her husband and his entire entrenched hostile government, are actively conspiring to have her isolated, marginalized, and ultimately dead? This was the deadly puzzle Cleopatra faced from the very first day of her reign. A challenge that would require every ounce of her cunning and bravery to simply survive, let alone triumph. In the year 51 BC, her father, the restored but still despised Ptolemy XII Auletes, finally died, leaving behind a kingdom teetering on the brink of financial collapse and civil war. His will, which was formally registered in Rome and thus backed by Roman authority, dictated a disastrous and inherently unstable arrangement. It forced Cleopatra, then a politically astute and ambitious 18-year-old, to marry and co-rule with her much younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was merely a 10-year-old boy. This forced marriage between siblings, a practice intended to keep power concentrated within the Ptolemaic line, was in this case a guaranteed recipe for political disaster, setting the stage for an immediate and inevitable power struggle. But the true power did not reside with the child king. The 10-year-old Ptolemy XIII wasn't really in charge of anything. He was a pawn, a pliable figurehead controlled entirely by a powerful and deeply misogynistic trio of senior courtiers. This cabal included Pothinus, an ambitious eunuch who held the position of chief minister and controlled the kingdom's treasury; Chilas, the formidable general who commanded the entire Egyptian army; Theodotus of Chios, the young king's tutor, who provided the intellectual justification for their political maneuvers. They were the true rulers of Egypt, and they had no intention of sharing power with a strong-willed woman. This controlling trio immediately saw Cleopatra's formidable intelligence. Her linguistic prowess. She was reputedly the first Ptolemaic, a ruler in 300 years to bother learning the Egyptian language. And her unconcealed ambition as a direct existential threat to their own authority and influence. They wasted no time in attempting to neutralize her. They systematically began erasing her name from official government decrees, ensuring that all royal edicts were issued solely in Ptolemy's name. Furthermore, they began minting new coins that featured only the young boy king's face. A powerful and public symbol designed to communicate to the masses that he, and by extension they, were the sole rulers of Egypt, thoroughly outmaneuvered by this powerful cabal, politically isolated within her own court, and genuinely fearing for her life as her power was stripped away day by day. Cleopatra was forced to make a difficult decision. She was pushed out of Alexandria, the capital, and fled to the relative safety of Syria around 49 BC. But this was not an act of surrender or a permanent exile. She was not defeated. She was merely biding her time. With characteristic resolve, she immediately began using her connections and remaining wealth to raise a mercenary army, fully intending to return to Egypt not as a supplicant, but as a conqueror, ready to wage war for her birthright. How do you, as an exiled queen, contrive a meeting with the single most powerful man in the known world, especially when your mortal enemies control every street, every guard post, and every entrance to the city where he is staying? The conventional routes are all barred. You don't walk in through the front gate. Instead, you devise a plan of such audacious theatrical brilliance that it becomes legend. You get smuggled in, rolled up inside a common carpet, just as Cleopatra's newly raised army reached a tense stalemate against her brother's formidable forces at the border of Egypt. The chaotic and bloody spectacle of Rome's civil war violently spilled onto Egyptian shores. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar, the greatest general of his age, arrived in Alexandria. He was not there as a tourist or a diplomat. He was in hot pursuit of his defeated archrival, Pompey the Great, whom he had just vanquished at the decisive Battle of Pharsalus. Caesar intended to capture Pompey and end the war for good. It was at this critical juncture that Ptolemy XIII's advisors, Berenice and Achilles, made a catastrophic and fatal miscalculation. Believing they could win Caesar's favor and secure his support for their regime against Cleopatra, they decided to offer him a gift. They had Pompey, who had sought refuge in Egypt, murdered on the beach as he stepped ashore. They then callously presented Pompey's severed pickled head to the Roman general upon his arrival at the palace. Caesar, however, was not pleased. He was profoundly disgusted. Pompey was not only a fellow Roman consul and his former ally, but also the widower of his only daughter Julia. This act of treachery against a respected Roman was an offense to his sense of dignitas dignity. Furious, Caesar immediately seized control of the royal palace, established his small Roman garrison, and acting as the executor of Ptolemy the 12th will imperiously summon both Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII to his presence to settle their dispute. But Cleopatra faced a critical problem. Her brother's army controlled the city. She was trapped outside the walls, unable to reach the one man who could restore her to power. This desperate situation led to her most legendary and audacious gamble, a story that would be retold for millennia. According to the historian Plutarch, her loyal servant Apollodorus the Sicilian undertook the perilous mission. He allegedly smuggled the queen past Achilles' guards, not in a grand carriage, but rolled up tightly inside a humble carpet or a large linen bed sack. He carried this bundle into the palace, claiming it was a valuable gift for Julius Caesar, and presented it directly to the Roman dictator in his private chambers. As the carpet was unrolled, the 21-year-old queen, far from being disheveled, emerged before him, a dramatic, intelligent, and courageous young woman who had just risked everything on this one theatrical move. Caesar, a man known for his appreciation of boldness and his weakness for intelligent women, instantly captivated, not just by her beauty, but by her sheer audacity, her political acumen, and her unyielding determination. In one single brilliant maneuver, she had completely bypassed her enemies, gained a private audience with the world's arbiter, and secured his undivided attention and, very quickly, his formidable alliance. Caesar was utterly captivated, both politically and personally, by this daring young queen who matched his own ambition. But this new, powerful alliance was not merely sealed with a private understanding or a kiss. It was an alliance that, from the very moment of its inception, was immediately and violently forged in the consuming fires of a desperate, unexpected war. Cleopatra had won Caesar's support, but now they would have to survive the consequences together. Berenice and Achilles, Ptolemy XIII's guardians, were not just disappointed. They were absolutely outraged. They realized that their gamble with Pompey's head had backfired spectacularly, and that Cleopatra, their mortal enemy, had now secured the most powerful ally on earth. Seeing their control over Egypt slipping away, they made a desperate final move. They unleashed their entire 20,000-man army, a force that vastly outnumbered Caesar's small contingent on the Roman-occupied section of Alexandria. Caesar and Cleopatra suddenly found themselves besieged, trapped inside the royal palace complex, fighting for their very lives in a brutal, street-by-street conflict that became known as the Alexandrian War. Desperate, heavily outnumbered, and cut off from the sea, Caesar, the master of improvisation, fought for sheer survival with a ruthless efficiency for which he was famous. In one of his most controversial tactical decisions during the siege, he ordered his men to set fire to the Egyptian fleet that was blockaded in the harbor. He did this to prevent his own escape route from being cut off, and to stop the enemy from using those ships to gain naval superiority. This massive fire tragically spread from the docks to the shore, engulfing parts of the city and, according to some accounts, destroying a large portion of the legendary Great Library of Alexandria. The bitter, grinding siege and war raged for months. But the tide turned definitively at the Battle of the Nile in 47 BC. Crucial Roman reinforcements, marching from Syria, finally arrived to relieve the beleaguered Caesar. In the ensuing large-scale battle, Caesar's experienced legions completely crushed Ptolemy's royalist forces. The 13-year-old boy king, Ptolemy XIII, attempting to flee the battlefield, reportedly drowned in the deep mud of the Nile River, weighed down by the heavy, ornate golden armor he wore. A pathetic end for the last male Ptolemaic king to challenge Cleopatra. With her primary rival and hostile brother now dead at the bottom of the Nile, Julius Caesar acting with the absolute authority of a Roman conqueror, declared Cleopatra the sole and official ruler, the Queen of Egypt. However, Roman sensibilities and Egyptian tradition both frowned upon an unmarried woman ruling alone. Therefore, Rome required the facade of a co-ruler. In a move that was purely for show, Caesar forced Cleopatra to marry her even younger brother Ptolemy XIV, who was then only about 11 or 12 years old. This boy king would be her co-ruler in name only. A powerless puppet who would never challenge her authority as his brother had. The 52-year-old Roman dictator and the 21-year-old Egyptian queen were now the undisputed absolute power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Their political alliance was total. Egypt was now a client state of Rome, and Cleopatra's throne was secured by Roman swords. And as all of Alexandria and soon all of Rome would come to know, this potent political alliance had also, during the months of the siege, become a deeply personal and passionate love affair. What could possibly be more scandalous to the conservative, xenophobic Roman elite than their aging married dictator having a public affair with a foreign queen? The answer soon became clear: having a foreign-born, illegitimate son with her, acknowledging him. And then, in an act of supreme arrogance, erecting a golden statue of his mistress in Rome itself, placing her next in 47 BC, not long after the conclusion of the Alexandrian War. Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar, but he was known to the world by the affectionate and politically loaded nickname Caesarion, which translates to Little Caesar. This child was, by all accounts, Caesar's only biological son, a fact that Caesar himself seemed to acknowledge, even if he never officially legitimized him under Roman law. This child was far more than just a baby. He was a living, breathing symbol of a potential new world order. He represented the unprecedented and too many Romans terrifying union of Rome's unparalleled military might and Egypt's ancient, divine, and unimaginably wealthy dynasty. In Caesarion, one could see the potential for a new line of rulers. A hybrid Greco-Roman monarchy that could one day rule the entire known world from Alexandria or Rome. A prospect that thrilled Cleopatra and horrified her enemies. In 46 BC, Caesar, at the height of his power, invited Cleopatra to come to Rome. She arrived with a spectacular entourage, bringing with her both her infant son, Caesarion, and her useless puppet king brother, Ptolemy XIV. She was housed not in a modest ambassador's residence, but in Caesar's own luxurious private villa across the Tiber River. A residence of opulent splendor where he openly entertained her, flaunting their relationship in the face of Roman tradition and his wife Calpurnia. But Caesar, in his growing arrogance and apparent disregard for republican sensibilities, went even further, committing an act that caused a massive and enduring scandal. He commissioned a magnificent golden statue of Cleopatra, not as a queen, but depicted in the divine form of the goddess Isis, the most powerful deity in the Egyptian pantheon. He then had this statue placed in the sacred temple of Venus Genitrix, the mythical divine ancestress of his own Julian family. To the conservative Roman elite, the senators and old families, this was not just poor taste. It was an act of profound sacrilege. Placing a living foreign monarcha barbarian queen among their gods was an unforgivable offense. It confirmed their deepest and most paranoid fears, that their dictator, Julius Caesar, was no longer a true Roman, but was bowing to a foreign queen, treating her as a living goddess, and perhaps even planning to make himself a king, with her as his queen, thereby destroying the Roman Republic forever. What happens to a foreign queen whose entire power base and physical safety depend on the protection of one man? when that all-powerful protector is suddenly and brutally murdered in broad daylight. Not by enemies on a battlefield, but by his own friends and allies in the very heart of the state. For Cleopatra, this was the nightmare that became a reality, signaling the end of her security and the beginning of a new, desperate struggle. At the moment of Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra was still residing in Rome, a deeply unpopular and widely reviled figure. She was the foreign mistress, the Egyptian whore, the symbol of Caesar's perceived monarchical ambitions. The same senators who had come to hate Caesar and his dictatorship also despised her with equal, if not greater, passion. They saw her as a corrupting influence, symbol of Eastern decadence and his tyranny, and the living embodiment of everything that was wrong with his rule. On March 15, 44 BC, the infamous Ides of March, the conspiracy came to its bloody conclusion. A group of senators, styling themselves as liberators and led by Marcus, Junius, Brutus, and Gaius Cassius Longinus, cornered Caesar at a meeting of the Senate. In a shocking, brutal explosion of violence, they swarmed him, stabbing him 23 times, killing the dictator for life at the foot of a statue of his former rival, Pompey. For Cleopatra, who was in her villa across the river, this news was an unmitigated catastrophe. Her protector, her lover, and the guarantor of her throne was dead. She and her son were suddenly isolated and desperately vulnerable, immediate targets for the assassins and the volatile Roman mob. Worse still, when Caesar's will was read, it delivered another devastating blow. He named his 18-year-old grandnephew Octavian as his primary heir and adopted son. Not Cleopatra's son, Caesarion. With this single act, her son Caesarion was politically nullified in Rome. He was now just the illegitimate foreign-born child of a dead tyrant. A footnote with no claim to Caesar's name, power, or property. With no allies left in the city, facing extreme and immediate danger from all sides, Cleopatra knew she had to act decisively. She gathered her son, her household, and her entourage and fled the chaos of Rome, embarking on a perilous journey back to her own kingdom. She rushed back to the relative safety of Alexandria, her primary goal now being to secure her own kingdom amidst the massive power vacuum left by Caesar's death. She needed to consolidate her power and eliminate any potential internal rivals. Her first move back home was a chilling, ruthless, and characteristically Ptolemaic one, her co-ruler and younger brother. The teenage Ptolemy XIV suddenly and mysteriously died. While no direct evidence exists, virtually all historians agree that he was poisoned, while certainly on her direct orders, to ensure that no one could use him as a puppet to challenge her sole authority. In the chaotic New World Order that followed Caesar's assassination, how do you, as an independent queen, humble the new, most powerful man in the Eastern world, a man who has summoned you as a subordinate? You don't just meet him on his terms. You stage an arrival so spectacular, so dripping with divine symbolism and opulent power, that you arrived not as a client queen, but as a living goddess, instantly captivating him and shifting the balance of power. After Caesar's death, the Roman world was violently torn apart and then uneasily divided among the victors. Following the Battle of Philippi, where Caesar's assassins were defeated, Mark Antony, Caesar's most loyal general and a charismatic, hard-living soldier, took control of the wealthy eastern provinces. In 41 BC, he summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in modern-day Turkey. His motives were practical. He desperately needed her money to pay his legions and her loyalty to secure his new eastern domain. He expected her to arrive as a humble vassal, a client queen answering to her new Roman master. Cleopatra, understanding the psychology of the man she was about to meet, did not come as a subordinate. She deliberately delayed her arrival, building anticipation, and then staged one of the most magnificent entrances in history. She sailed up the Kidnus River to Tarsus, not on a simple royal ship, but on a breathtakingly opulent barge. According to Plutarch's famous description, the stern was covered in gold. The billowing sails were a royal purple, the most expensive dye in the world. and the oars, which beat the water in time to music, were plated in silver. As described in vivid detail by Plutarch, she herself lay under a golden spangled canopy. Conspicuously dressed not as a queen but as Venus, the Roman goddess of love, or Aphrodite, her Greek equivalent. She was fanned by young boys dressed as painted cupids, and her most beautiful handmaidens were attired as sea nymphs and graces. The air itself was filled with the impossibly rich scent of exotic perfumes and incense burning on the barge, a sensory overload designed to overwhelm and enchant. The spectacle was a total success. The entire population of Tarsus, mesmerized by the rumors and the otherworldly sight, ran down to the river to see this vision of the goddess Venus arriving. The crowds were so thick that they completely emptied the city's marketplace, leaving Mark Antony, the supposed master of the East, waiting alone and looking foolish on his official tribunal, abandoned by the very people he had assembled to impress. Adding to the calculated display of power, Antony, though left waiting, invited her to dine with him. She audaciously refused, replying that it was more fitting that he should come to her. She then invited him to a lavish, impossibly decadent feast prepared on her barge. Captivated by her confidence, her wealth, and her divine persona, Antony went. In that single moment, the entire power dynamic was instantly and masterfully reversed. He had come as a general summoning a subject. He ended the night as a guest, enchanted by a goddess. How do you decisively and permanently start a devastating civil war, turning the entire Roman Republic against you? For Mark Antony, the path was clear. You stage a bizarre, quasi-divine public spectacle and, in an act of supreme political folly, you illegally give away vast conquered Roman territories to the foreign children you have fathered with your Egyptian lover, effectively declaring a new empire in defiance of Rome. By 34 BC, Mark Antony and Cleopatra were not just allies. They were a notorious public couple, living as husband and wife, though Antony was still legally married to Octavian's sister in Rome. Their union had produced 3 more children: the twins Alexander Helios, the sun, and Cleopatra Selene, the moon, and a younger son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. These children were the foundation of their shared dynastic ambitions for a new Eastern Empire. In that year, following a moderately successful military campaign in Armenia, Antony held a massive, unprecedented public ceremony in the Gymnasium of Alexandria, an event now known as the Donations of Alexandria. He and Cleopatra sat on opulent golden thrones, elevated on a silver platform, dressed as the living gods Dionysus, the Roman Bacchus, and Isis. This was not just a celebration. It was a carefully staged political declaration. During this ceremony, Antony made a series of shocking announcements. He declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings, a title that placed her above all other monarchs, effectively claiming she was an empress. He then named her son, Caesarion Caesar's son, as the King of Kings and the true, legitimate heir of Julius Caesar, a declaration that was a direct mortal insult and challenge to Caesar's adopted son and heir in Rome, Octavian. As if this wasn't inflammatory enough, Antony proceeded to name his own young children with Cleopatra as monarchs of Roman-controlled or allied territories. Alexander Helios was named King of Armenia, Media, and Parthia, which Antony hadn't even fully conquered. Cleopatra Selene was given Cyrenaica and Libya, and the young Ptolemy Philadelphus was granted Syria, Phoenicia, and Cilicia. In effect, Antony was unilaterally dismantling Rome's eastern provinces and giving them away to his half-Egyptian children, an act that was illegal, arrogant, and treasonous in the eyes of the Senate. Back in Rome, Antony's rival, the cold, calculating, and brilliant politician Octavian, seized on this event with ruthless precision. He now had the perfect propaganda weapon. He meticulously painted a picture for the Senate and the people of Rome. Mark Antony was no longer a true Roman. He was a man bewitched, a deluded, decadent slave who had abandoned his heritage, his wife, and his duty, all for a debauched foreign witch queen. The donations of Alexandria were not a celebration, Octavian argued, but the founding act of a new, hostile empire. How do you win a war before a single arrow is loosed or a single sword is drawn? You launch a propaganda campaign, a character assassination so vicious, so relentless, and so perfectly targeted that it turns an entire empire against one single woman, transforming a political dispute between two Roman men into a holy war against a foreign other. This was Octavian's genius. In Rome, Octavian masterfully and relentlessly weaponized the news of the donations of Alexandria. He portrayed Antony not as a strategic rival, but as a weak-willed, morally decayed Roman. A great general who had been utterly enslaved by the witchcraft, sorcery, and decadent, un-Roman sexuality of a foreign queen. Cleopatra was cast as the villain. The Eastern temptress who sought to destroy the Republic and move the capital from the Tiber to the Nile. Octavian's propaganda brilliantly contrasted the foreign debauched Cleopatra with his own sister Octavia. Octavia was Antony's virtuous, loyal, and abandoned Roman wife, a model of Republican womanhood matrona. The conflict was framed for the public not as a political squabble, but as a moral crusade. It was the loyal, chaste Roman matron versus the manipulative foreign whore, a battle for the Octavian's absolute masterstroke. The move that sealed Antony's fate came in 32 BC. In an act of questionable legality, but political brilliance. He forcibly and illegally seized Mark Antony's sealed will from the custody of the Vestal Virgins in Rome. He then read its contents aloud to the horrified and outraged Senate. The will, whether genuine or partially forged by Octavian, confirmed all of Rome's worst fears. It allegedly verified that Antony was giving away vast Roman territories to Cleopatra's children. Even worse, it contained a deeply sentimental and, to the Romans, treasonous request that upon his death, wherever he might die, his body should be sent to Alexandria to be buried beside Cleopatra, not in his ancestral home in Rome. This was the ultimate betrayal, the final proof that his loyalties no longer lay with Rome. The Senate was incensed. Octavian, with breathtaking cleverness, used this outrage to his full advantage. He had Antony stripped of his powers and cleverly declared war not on the fellow Roman, Antony, which would have been an unpopular civil war, but exclusively and personally on Queen Cleopatra of Egypt. The final war of the Roman Republic had begun, framed as a righteous crusade against a foreign enemy. How do you lose a battle that decides the fate of the entire known world? A battle for which you have assembled one of the largest armadas in history. For Mark Antony, the answer was as shocking as it was simple. By inexplicably abandoning over 500 warships and 70,000 legionaries in the heat of battle simply to chase after the one woman whose ship was fleeing the scene. On the fateful day of September 2nd, 31 BC, the final epic showdown arrived. Octavian's formidable fleet, commanded by his close friend and brilliant naval genius, Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, had successfully blockaded Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet inside the cramped Gulf of Actium, on the coast of Greece. The stage was set for the largest naval battle in Roman history. On paper, Antony had a significant advantage. His ships' massive quinquiremes were larger, taller, and more heavily armed, like floating fortresses. However, they were also slow, difficult to maneuver, and, due to rampant disease and desertions, critically undermanned. In contrast, Agrippa commanded a fleet of smaller, faster, more agile Liburnian vessels, crewed by well-trained, highly motivated sailors. Agrippa, a master of naval tactics, had Antony effectively trapped against the shore. The battle, when it was finally joined, was not a conventional fight to win for Antony. It was, from the outset, a desperate, pre-planned breakout. The strategy was not to defeat Agrippa, but to use the heavy, fortress-like ships to punch a hole through the center of Octavian's blockade, allowing Cleopatra's squadron, which crucially carried the vast Egyptian war treasury, to escape and continue the fight from Egypt. In the chaos of the afternoons fighting Cleopatra, stationed with her 60-ship squadron in the rear, saw the pre-arranged signal or a gap in the line. She gave the order. And her ships hoisted their sails, a move useless in combat, but essential for escape, and fled the battle at high speed. Her flagship, the Antonia, led the charge, racing for the open sea, abandoning the rest of the fleet to its fate. Antony, fighting on his own flagship, saw her squadron leaving. In a move that has stunned and baffled historians for 2 millennia, he made an inexplicable, catastrophic decision. He abandoned his flagship, which was heavily engaged with the enemy, boarded a smaller, faster ship, and personally chased after Cleopatra, leaving his entire fleet and army behind, leaderless and confused in the middle of a life-or-death battle. Leaderless, demoralized, and utterly betrayed by their commander's desertion. Antony's powerful fleet was now hopelessly trapped. Agrippa's smaller, nimbler ships swarmed them, isolating the massive vessels and attacking them one by one with catapults, archers, and fire. The result was a total, catastrophic, and decisive victory for Octavian. Antony's entire navy was either burned, sunk, or captured. What happens to 19 loyal, battle-hardened legions, a force of over 100,000 professional soldiers, when their legendary general, the man they have followed across the world, suddenly abandons them mid-battle to flee with his lover? They were left, standing on the shore, confused, leaderless, and forced to watch the complete annihilation of their navy. Antony's powerful land army, which was encamped on the hills overlooking the Gulf of Actium and led by his veteran general Cneidius Crassus, could only watch in helpless horror as the naval disaster unfolded below them. They were confused by the smoke, then shocked by the sight of Cleopatra's squadron fleeing, and finally utterly demoralized by the realization that their own commander, Mark Antony, had fled with her. For 7 agonizing days, the legions held their ground, a testament to their deep, ingrained loyalty. They refused to believe the reports, convinced that their legendary commander had not, and could not, have fled in such a cowardly manner. They waited, scanning the horizon, praying for his return, believing he would come back and lead them to victory against Octavian's land forces. But Mark Antony was gone, consumed by his flight with Cleopatra. The loyalty of the army finally snapped when their own top general, Cneidius Crassus, lost his nerve, realizing the situation was hopeless and that Antony was not returning. Crassus abandoned the army himself, fleeing under cover of darkness to try and find Antony in Egypt, a final devastating act of betrayal. Seeing this ultimate betrayal from their top commanders, the legion's loyalty, once unshakable, completely shattered. The soldiers, feeling abandoned and with no cause left to fight for, defected to Octavian en masse. In a stroke, Antony's entire land force, one of the most powerful armies in the world, was gone, surrendered without a single fight. Simultaneously, as news of the disaster at Actium spread, the remaining Egyptian fleets and garrisons stationed in other parts of the Mediterranean, such as Libya and Syria, recognized the futility of further resistance. They all surrendered to Octavian's commanders. In the span of about 1 week, Mark Antony's entire military might, built over decades, had completely and irrevocably evaporated. He was utterly, indisputably finished. How does a general who once commanded half the Roman world, a man who had been Caesar's right hand and a legend in his own time, finally die? It was not in a blaze of glory on the battlefield, charging against his enemies. It was a pathetic, drawn-out, and tragic end, abandoned by his troops, betrayed by his allies, and bleeding to death from a botched, self-inflicted wound. Antony returned to Alexandria with Cleopatra, not as a defiant king, but as a broken, hollowed-out man. He spent his final months in a haze of despair and apathy, awaiting the inevitable, as Octavian's unstoppable legions, having consolidated their power finally, arrived at the gates of Alexandria in the summer of 30 BC for the final conquest of Egypt. As Octavian's forces closed in, Antony attempted one last, desperate defense. In a sudden flash of his old, brilliant self, He gathered what little cavalry remained loyal to him and led them in a furious, courageous charge, actually winning a brief final skirmish against the invaders. It was a pointless, fleeting moment of his former brilliance, a final echo of the great general he had once been. The very next day, his final comprehensive stand was set. He drew up his remaining infantry, prepared his fleet, and watched from a high point as the battle was set to commence. But as he watched, in a final, soul-crushing betrayal, his entire remaining fleet sailed out and defected to Octavian without a fight. His cavalry, seeing this, did the same. He was completely and utterly abandoned by all. At that moment, a false rumor, perhaps started by Cleopatra herself in a desperate, misguided attempt to rouse him, or perhaps from a panicked servant, reached him. The queen was dead, having taken her own life. This final blow completely destroyed what was left of his spirit. Utterly destroyed, Antony cried out that he had nothing left to live for and would join her in death. He commanded his loyal servant, Eros, to kill him, to run him through with a sword as a loyal servant should. But Eros, loyal to the end and unable to kill the master he loved, turned the sword on himself, killing himself instead. Shamed by his servant's loyalty and his own hesitation, Antony grabbed his own sword and fell upon it, attempting to end his life. But the wound was a bad one. It was not immediately fatal, leaving him mortally wounded in agony and bleeding to death slowly. She had now lost her lover, her fleet, her army, and her kingdom. Her entire world had collapsed. But her enemies, led by the cold and calculating Octavian, wanted one last thing from her: her dignity. They wanted her as a living trophy, and she knew she would rather die than give them the satisfaction. Cleopatra, upon hearing of Antony's botched suicide and the fall of the city, had barricaded herself inside her own partially constructed fortress-like mausoleum. With her were her two most loyal handmaidens, Iras and Charmian, and a eunuch. The massive, heavy doors were sealed from the inside, making entry by force nearly impossible. The dying, bleeding Mark Antony, hearing that she was in fact still alive, begged his men to carry him to her tomb. They brought his shattered body to the base of the mausoleum, unable to open the heavy doors and with Roman soldiers closing in. The women, in a desperate, frantic scene, had to hoist the dying general up the high walls using ropes and bandages, lifting his dead weight through an upper window. He was brought inside, and in a final, tragic scene, Mark Antony, the great general, died in her arms. Octavian, arriving at the palace shortly after, was determined to take Cleopatra alive. His primary goal was to capture her and parade her through the streets of Rome in his triumph, the ultimate symbol of his victory and her humiliation. He sent his trusted man, Gaius Procalius, to negotiate with her at the sealed door of the tomb. But this negotiation was all a clever, cruel trick, while Procalius distracted Cleopatra. Convincing her to talk to him through the barred door, another Roman soldier, Cornelius Gallus, used a ladder to find and scale the same high window that Antony had been hoisted through. He and his men climbed in, surprising the queen from behind. Her absolute worst fear, the one fate she considered more terrifying than death, was being paraded in chains through the streets of Rome as the centerpiece of Octavian's triumphal procession. A spectacle of ultimate humiliation for her and her children. When she was finally granted a meeting with the cold, impassive Octavian, she pleaded for her children's lives. But on her own fate, she was resolute, famously declaring, "I will not be led in triumph." Did a venomous snake, a deadly asp hidden in a humble basket of figs, truly end the 3,000-year line of Egyptian pharaohs? The truth is far stranger, more mysterious, and more debated than the simple dramatic legend. The exact method of her death remains one of history's most compelling unsolved mysteries, deliberately obscured by Roman propaganda. On or around August 10th, 30 BC, Cleopatra, now under strict house arrest in her palace, seemed to resign herself to her fate. She was granted permission to perform funeral rites for Antony. Afterward, she bathed, ordered a lavish final feast, and then, with great ceremony, dressed herself in her finest royal robes, adorning herself with the full regalia of her divine persona as the queen and goddess Isis. According to the most famous story, it's propagated by Plutarch, a man, a simple rustic from the country, arrived at the palace carrying a basket of large ripe figs, a gift for the queen. The Roman guards, tasked with watching her every move, inspected the basket briefly, but finding nothing obviously suspicious under the top leaves, they let the man pass. The instrument of her death was now inside. When Octavian's men, supposedly alerted by a worried messenger from the queen, grew fearful of what she might be planning, they burst into her chambers. They were too late. The scene they found was not one of violence, but of a strange, silent, royal tableau. Cleopatra lay dead on her golden couch, already cold, looking as if she were merely asleep, dressed in all her royal finery. Her devoted handmaiden Iris lay dead at her feet, having apparently died just moments before her queen. Her other loyal servant, Charmian, was visibly weak, staggering, and clearly dying herself, but was still using her last ounce of strength to weakly adjust the royal diadem on Cleopatra's head, ensuring her queen met death with her crown straight. One of the enraged Roman soldiers, shocked by the scene and Octavian's fury, allegedly shouted, "A fine deed, Charmian." Was this well done? In a final, legendary act of defiance, Charmian reportedly replied, "It is most fine," and befitting the descendant of so many kings. And with those words, she, too, collapsed and died, loyal to the very end. The truth of how she died remains unknown. The story of the asp was politically perfect for Octavian. A snake was a symbol of Egyptian royalty and divinity, the uraeus on the pharaoh's crown, but also seen by Romans as treacherous, exotic, and cowardly. It allowed Octavian to claim she died a coward's death, unfit for a Roman. In his later triumph, robbed of her living body, he paraded a large effigy of her with a snake clinging to her arm, cementing this version of the story into history. Other theories persist. A poisoned comb, a hidden vial of toxin, but the asp remains the most powerful legend. Octavian was reportedly furious, robbed of his ultimate prize. He had wanted to humiliate her, but in death, she had defied him one last time. However, perhaps respecting her incredible spirit and her royal status, or perhaps to simply close the chapter, he granted her final wish. She was buried in royal splendor with all proper rites in the mausoleum right next to Mark Antony. With the queen now dead, a final brutal piece of business remained. What would happen to her king of kings, the 17-year-old Caesarion, the boy who was Julius Caesar's only biological son? His existence was a threat Octavian could not tolerate. Octavian, as Caesar's adopted son, had a precarious claim to his name. The 17-year-old Caesarion, as the biological son, was a direct and dangerous rival, a potential rallying point for any future opposition. His tutor, in a final act of betrayal, betrayed him, luring him back to Alexandria from his escape route to India with the false promise that Octavian would make him a client king. Octavian, famously consulting his advisors, is said to have quoted Homer, declaring, "Two Caesars are one too many, aut agathon polyquerene." It is not good to have many rulers. His decision was cold and pragmatic. He had his adopted father's only son captured, brought back to Alexandria, and then quietly, unceremoniously strangled to death, eliminating the last king of kings forever. Antony's children with Cleopatra, the twins Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, and their sister Cleopatra Selene were spared this fate. As they posed no direct blood threat to Octavian's lineage, they were taken as high-status prisoners to Rome. They were forced to walk, adorned in heavy chains, in Octavian's magnificent triumphal parade, a public spectacle of their mother's defeat. After this public humiliation, in a surprising and much-lauded act of magnanimity, the children were not executed. They were given into the care of Octavian's own sister, Octavia the Virtuous, noble Roman wife whom their father, Mark Antony, had abandoned for their mother. In one of history's great ironies, Octavia raised her rival's children in her own household alongside her own children by Antony. The two boys, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, vanished from the historical records soon after. It is widely presumed that they died young, either from illness, which was common, or perhaps from a more convenient quiet accident. But Cleopatra Selene survived into adulthood. Augustus Octavian later arranged a political marriage for her. He married her to King Juba II of Numidia, making her the Queen of Mauritania, a Roman client kingdom in North Africa. She would go on to be a successful and powerful ruler, the only one of her siblings to carry on their mother's legacy. On August 1st, 30 BC, Octavian formally and officially annexed the Kingdom of Egypt. It was not made a regular Roman province, managed by the Senate. Instead, it became his personal, private property, the personal estate of the emperor, governed by a prefect loyal only to him. This vast ancient land, the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, would now serve to feed his new empire and fund his ambitions. The 3,000-year line of the pharaohs, which had begun in the mists of antiquity, was definitively over. The Hellenistic Age, the era of Greek-ruled kingdoms that had begun with Alexander the Great's conquests 300 years earlier, was also over. The chaotic, bloody, and century-long death spiral of the Roman Republic was finished. The Roman Empire had truly and fully begun. Cleopatra was dead. She had lost her kingdom, her lover, and her life. But her story, the one crafted almost entirely by her Roman victors like Octavian and the poets and historians who wrote for him, was just beginning. In their histories, she became a powerful and enduring legend, the ultimate seductress. The decadent Eastern queen, the foreign threat who used her sexuality to destroy great Roman men. Was she truly the power-hungry, manipulative witch that Roman propaganda claimed she was? Or was she, perhaps, a brilliant, highly intelligent, multilingual stateswoman, and a shrewd politician, a monarch who used every single weapon at her disposal, her intellect, her wealth, her charm, and yes, her sexuality in a desperate, high-stakes fight to save her kingdom and her dynasty from being swallowed whole by the relentlessly expanding, conquering empire of Rome. Her true face, her coins depicting her with a strong nose and chin, is lost to us, overshadowed by the Hollywood fantasies. Her true voice, her thoughts, her motivations are lost, as all her writings are gone, and her story is told only by her enemies. But her legacy is clear and undeniable. She was the last independent ruler of ancient Egypt, the final pharaoh, and the woman who, for 2 decades, skillfully played the game of empires, challenged the might of Rome itself, and ultimately, tragically, lost. With her death and the absorption of Egypt's vast wealth, Octavian, her final adversary, became unchallengeable. He would soon be granted the title Augustus, becoming the first and perhaps greatest Roman emperor. The Republic was officially dead, though he maintained its facade. The new Roman Empire, an age of autocracy that would define the Western world for centuries, was born. And it was all built in no small part on the ruins of her ambition and the fall of her ancient kingdom.